Samuel's native name was Sunshine and hers Wildfire. So again, she's roughed up together, which leads me to believe they actually did have the same mom, especially because Samuel was also had a native name. And then, of course, in her interviews, Lewis says, "we, her children," referencing her brother, right? So also what's interesting about the census data is that Samuel is listed as mulatto in both the 1870 and 1880 census. His racial classification could have been his own testimony or the assumption of the census taker. So just a few things. There's so much to talk about. I can go on about this for a while, but just a few things before I end here. This is an image of the census that you can click on and zoom in on. He lists both of his parents as being born in the West Indies, right? And then some other things I want to show you. So he goes to San Francisco, and I'm like, okay, there's 1 in 7 of the Black residents in San Francisco were foreign born. So that was a really interesting piece of information. Another interesting piece of information I found came from the United States Census. So in the census documentation, it says immigration from the West Indies has been available since 1820. Between 1820 and 1860, there was no classification of the West Indies by country. Therefore, data for this period, the term Other America, which I think is very interesting given that the term othered is one that we've probably all heard in some way before. So this term Other America includes Mexico, the West Indies, Central and South America. So for the populations that are coming in from this period, they could be from anywhere in this region. Also between 1850 and 1860, the population of free colored persons in the West went from 1,200 to 4,000. So there could have been multiple waves that Samuel Lewis was a part of. I have an image here. This is not Samuel Lewis, but I kind of wanted to use it as a reference to just showcase the lives of Black miners and Black miners who traveled from across the country, across the world to participate in the gold rush. Here I have an image of Samuel Lewis's listing in the directory in Bozeman, Montana. After he leaves San Francisco, making money in the gold rush, he moves to Montana. He's listed as having $500 in 1870, which in today's money is about 10,000 American dollars. And then at his death, his house was worth 25,000. So this kind of is a map that shows, and this is one of the questions I have for everyone, like whether I should do a story map kind of showing his travel instead of the long scroll like I'm doing here. But this is kind of showing his travels. And then the last thing I want to close out here with is his will, in which he was able to leave Edmonia what was about $200,000 today. So this is in the late 19th century. So as you can all imagine, this story is very unique to the Black experience, which is why I wanted to write about it. You know, there's a lot of attention on which there should be, of course, on the experience of the majority who were enslaved. But I just thought it was interesting to look at a unique story like this one, especially because Samuel Lewis's presence in both San Francisco and Montana contributed to the development of the Black community in these places. So his house is actually a national landmark in the United States. And one last thing I wanted to read to you all. This section is on Samuel Lewis in public memory, because I want to think about how we're telling the story, right? So Montana's historical society, they position him as Haitian. So the story of Black Bozeman, which Bozeman is a town in Montana, is in many ways a story of successful individuals. The most successful was certainly Samuel Lewis, a Haitian barber and land developer who took full advantage of Bozeman's residential housing boom of the late 1800s. Lewis bought properties and built houses for the purpose of renting to the city's citizens, who were affluent citizens. At the time of his death in 1896, his estate was worth a small fortune. His life had been a struggle uphill, both socially and professionally. And also, as I mentioned before, he supported his sister, who's a famous sculptor, through school and through her transition to Italy. He also traveled to Europe, which is also not as common for Black persons at this time. And the last part here I wanted to read to you all. While Samuel Lewis and his extravagant life is best known, it is not, however, typical of the Black experience. So this is just a snapshot from how the Montana Historical Society remembers him. So that's kind of a snapshot of what I'm working on right now. Thank you for bearing with me as I tried to kind of explain everything. And I'm open to questions, comments, and feedback on my site.
So, any questions? Yes, Sama. Oh, do we have an extra mic?
Yeah.
No, you're gonna just shout. You gotta shout.
Yeah. Arsenio Hartley. Sama. I was interested. It's an interesting story she was presenting. Never heard of the person before, and so it's good to hear about Black men, Black people that did that type of development in that time period. Or you mentioned this little anecdote with the taxi driver and they change the name spelling and how that could influence where the person came from. And it intrigued me because the Black experience, Caribbean experience coming to Panama, found that many folks who came had their names changed, not willfully, but many times accidentally. It was just changed. Here we have families whose brother and sister are Clark, one with a Clark E and the other one with a Clark without an E. Because when they registered names, they simply changed them. I have an aunt who was Edna, coming from Cuba, but when she got Panama, she's Enna. So these things happened on a regular basis, and folks, their names completely changed over. And I wouldn't doubt that coming into the US, that type of experience will not be real as well.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you as well. I'd never known about Samuel Lewis. I think we're come from an art history and art museum background. Certainly Edmonia Lewis, but knowing about the benefactor, and again, thank you for providing that context. You mentioned story maps earlier, and just as a suggestion, I think that might be a really great platform for you to use, because this is as much I wouldn't say a travelogue, but sort of a life's journey, right? So I think place is such an important part of your research and what you're presenting, and I think that story maps would allow you to better co-locate these major changes in their lives and in their socioeconomic and racial position across the Americas and the Caribbean in a way that I think would just be a bit more dynamic. Because you have a lot of amazing content, so I think it would really lend itself to the type of work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So to your first comment, thank you very much. That's the challenge of doing this sort of work, because I'm reading against the white gaze, right? So they're being classified as mulatto, and excuse some of the words that I'm using. I know they're not like contemporary understandings of identity. It's just I'm quoting from those texts, but they're being listed as biracial, when that might not be how they're identifying. So I'm like trying to read through this while understanding, their names could have been changed. So how do I entertain both sides, And then to your response, thank you. That's what I was thinking as I realized. I was like, I think this would be better articulated to like an international audience if there was a story map, so we could get a sense of how far he's traveling. I think it's a total of like 4,100 miles, including things I don't even know.
So my name is Tasha, and I want to just piggyback off of the comment. I just attended a restorative justice conference, transformation conference, and one of the things that was brought up is that what's inherent to our culture is that we are storytellers and we're not linear, right? So offering a story map adds the ebbs and flows to these transitions in our lives that I feel that we will just naturally gravitate towards, as opposed to this is very standard, blanketed experience that's really not inherent to what we watch you on through.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yes.
Awesome.
excuse me, I don't get it that quickly. Now I have everybody's attention. My question is this. I note I call it financial security that Lewis was able to obtain and maintain. And I'm wondering, and trying to make a comparison to present day society in the context of Black people. What obstacles are there, if you think there are some, that has prevented Black people from attaining the same kind of financial security?
Yeah, so that's a huge question. That's like a
Well,
book's
you
worth
can take it in
question.
parts.
Yes. So my initial thoughts are that, for one, Edmonia Lewis and her brother are living through this period in America, Reconstruction, and then the laws that are retracted after the Civil War, right? So African Americans are given rights in the United States and then they're retracted. So even after African Americans are freed from enslavement, and I'm certain I know that in a comparative study, this would be the case in the Caribbean too. There are these systematic structures in place that prevent that from happening to the majority. This story intrigues me because it's so unique. I feel like Samuel Lewis is in the right place at the right time. He heard about the gold rush, he went and he struck gold, that is luck, right? But he also had like exposure, some sort of education that allowed him to invest. And he's part of this narrative of the Black frontier that I'm really interested in too. So both of them, like, I keep trying to acknowledge that I know both of their stories are very unique because for the majority, there's so many structures in place that prevent that from being like the common narrative.
I just want to offer two perspectives. This is a very interesting presentation. One, the role of colorism in that particular context. What I mean by that, you see how you described the mulatto representation or description. In the Caribbean history, as you well know, you have other gradations, if you lack of a better term, of mixtures of Black. And so maybe it reminds me of a story I heard from an 88-year-old Caribbean gentleman living in Canada. He said that when he migrated there as a teenager, he did not say to anyone that where he was from originally, right? So you mentioned 4 different types of census reporting. So that might be a lens through which to look at it as well. And then colorism, because it's not, as you can tell, not all Caribbean people look the same, right? And in terms of our skin color, it very much plays a role globally, how people perceive each other. So that might be a factor to consider when you're doing your research. So those 2 ideas came to mind.
Yes, absolutely. I was trying to find the quote. I had skipped over it, but in his obituary, he was remembered as a white man in his entire makeup, and that's a quote. And he was described as such physically and socially. So there's so much I didn't get to talk about, but that's definitely a factor, I think, because if he's viewed in that way, I know that would grant him certain access, and it's possible that we have no pictures, but he might have even been able to pass. Yeah.
It's interesting because I found 2 Samuel W. Lewis, one from Madison County. He was born in Canada circa 1845, listed on the 1880 census in Madison County. He's occupation school teacher with wife Ida and 3 young children, and he's a Black colored person. And there's another Samuel W. Lewis who was a former United States ambassador to Israel who's white, so perhaps that's why the names, there's a white Samuel W. Lewis and
Right.
Black Samuel W. Lewis.
Right.
So this is the last question because we need to,
Yeah.
yes.
But tying together what you were saying and what the gentleman in the back said about kind of the selection of identities or selection of origin countries, that to your point about the structural impediments put in place after 1865, after the end of the Civil War, depending on the gradation of your skin tone, particularly if you were a descendant of someone who had been enslaved, it was to your advantage to select an identity that didn't associate you with having been a
Yes,
descendant of a
okay.
enslaved person.
Absolutely,
So
yeah.
people who were
Thank
from
you.
the Caribbean, as well as people who were formerly enslaved, or the children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of formerly enslaved people, depending on their skin tone, would select other identities in order to pass into other parts of society, particularly as they migrated west. Because there were impediments to, if you had been enslaved, what you could access in terms of land and funding to start to purchase property in the western parts of the United States. So just considering the context,
Yeah.
every 10 years,
It's a
how it
limitation of the
changed.
archive. It's
Yeah.
actually the limitation of the archive. So what a census doesn't tell you is the underlying socioeconomic context that would make a Caribbean identity a more viable identity.
Okay,
So it's not,
yes.
so there's actually other, I'm trying to remember who the authors are, but there are discussions in the scholarship about the ways in which Caribbean identity gets mobilized to kind of form a buffer to structural racism. Yeah.
Depending on the time period.
Yes, absolutely.
Every 10 years, those things would change. The public policy, the law in
Which
place
is would
would
change.
change.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much, because in my first chapter, I questioned why Edmonia Lewis is constantly identifying herself as Native American and not African American. And that will tie both of their stories together very nicely. So thank you all so much.